What happens when a reporter attacks your family? Barron Trump's shocking response to a liberal reporter's attack on Melania leaves him humiliated. You won't believe what happens next. The air inside the grand ballroom of the New York Charity Gala was thick with anticipation. Under the glittering chandeliers, high society figures, philanthropists, and elite media members sipped champagne and discussed the latest headlines. Tonight, they weren't just here to socialize or network, but to witness the recognition of a remarkable woman. Melania Trump, in a stunning midnight blue gown, was the guest of honor. Despite the political noise surrounding her husband, she had always maintained grace, focusing on charity work and staying above the fray. Tonight was no exception. As she stepped onto the stage, the murmurs in the hall faded in silence, giving way to undivided attention. Her voice rang out, soft yet confident, her Slovenian accent adding an elegant touch. She spoke about children's education, humanitarian aid, and the future she aspired to build for the less fortunate. Everything was going smoothly, a moment of solemnity until a voice sharp as a blade sliced through the air. Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda? The room froze. Quick glances were exchanged, chairs subtly shifted as guests adjusted their postures, waiting for what would happen next. Jack Turner, a political correspondent infamous for his relentless acts on conservatives under the guise of journalistic integrity, stood at the front row, tall, impeccably dressed, yet his tone carried a clear challenge. He gripped his microphone as if it were a weapon. Melania hesitated briefly, her lips slightly parted, but before she could answer, Turner pressed on. Your husband has been accused of dividing the country, of fostering hate, he continued, his voice bolder now that all eyes were on him. And yet, here you stand, presenting yourself as a role model. Don't you think the real role models are those who are fighting against him? The words hung heavy in the air, thick with tension. A few reporters smirked, sensing a viral moment in the making. Just as Melania was about to respond, another voice shattered the silence, firm, unwavering. That's enough. Every head turned toward the source of the interruption. Barron Trump was stepping forward from the audience. No longer the quiet boy the world had seen in the White House. At 17, he was tall, self-assured, and carried himself with the confidence of someone raised in the public eye. But tonight, he wasn't just the president's son. He was his own person, and he wasn't about to let anyone disrespect his mother. Barron strode past the tables, shoulders broad, jaw clenched. He stepped onto the stage without hesitation, positioning himself between his mother and the journalist. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. Excuse me? Turner raised an eyebrow, surprised but not backing down. Barron didn't blink. You can ask tough questions, he said, his voice calm but unshakable. But what you're doing isn't journalism, it's bullying. The room erupted into whispers. Caught off guard, Turner let out a breathy chuckle, trying to brush it off. Oh, and I suppose the president's son is going to lecture me on media ethics. Barron tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto Turner's, sharp and unwavering. No, Barron said smoothly. I'm going to show you what respect looks like. The tension in the ballroom transformed from an undercurrent to a tidal wave. All eyes were on Barron. No one had expected him to step in not like this, not with such controlled confidence. Jack Turner, the liberal journalist who had sparked the confrontation, was still processing the moment. He had anticipated a flustered, awkward Melania, perhaps even a misstep he could spin into a viral clip. What he hadn't expected was Barron Trump standing his ground. The smirk on Turner's face wavered for just a second before he composed himself, shaking his head as if amused. Respect, he repeated mockingly. Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you or your family are in a position to lecture the press about respect. Some audience members chuckled uneasily. Others remained frozen, watching the unexpected showdown unfold. Barron didn't flinch. His shoulders squared, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but immovable. You can ask whatever questions you want, he said. But what you just did, you didn't ask a question. You tried to humiliate my mother. Turner's smirk faded slightly, but he held his ground. Mrs. Trump is a public figure, he countered. She should expect tough questions. Barron took a slow step closer, his height forcing Turner to look up at him slightly. Then why didn't you ask her about her work tonight? About the children she's helping? The crowd stirred. It was a simple question, but it struck deep. Turner had no real response, and he knew it. His job was never to highlight Melania's accomplishments. It was to reduce her to a political pawn. Before Turner could recover, Barron continued. You came here with one goal: to make headlines. You didn't care about what this event is actually about. You wanted a viral clip, something to throw on Twitter to get a few thousand likes from people who already agree with you. The room fell completely silent. A few guests near the back exchanged looks, realizing that Barron wasn't just reacting, he was controlling this moment. Turner's confidence faltered. He glanced at the other journalists in the room, as if hoping for backup, but none of them spoke. They weren't used to being called out like this, not by a Trump, and certainly not by a 17-year-old. Melania, who had been standing quietly behind her son, placed a gentle hand on his arm. She didn't say a word, but her expression spoke volumes. Pride, strength, a silent message, I'm right here with you. Turner, realizing he was losing ground fast, tried to regain control. He forced a smirk and folded his arms. You're young, Barron, he said, shaking his head. You don't understand how this works. Barron didn't blink. I understand exactly how this works, he said smoothly. I've been watching people like you attack my family since I was a kid. The journalist's smirk faded completely. Barron took another step forward, his voice steady. I just didn't think you'd be pathetic enough to attack a woman who's done nothing but try to help others. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Someone near the back actually gasped. Even some of the journalists who had expected another routine hit job on a Trump were stunned into silence. The ballroom was thick with tension, a palpable weight hanging in the air. All eyes flickered between Barron Trump and Jack Turner, the once confident journalist who now looked visibly shaken. A man in a tailored suit had just stood up in the audience, his salt and pepper hair lending him an air of authority. Barron's right, he said firmly. This is a charity event, not a place for political stunts. The murmurs rippled across the room like waves in a storm. More and more attendees nodded in agreement, recognizing that the night had shifted. Jack Turner, who had walked into the event expecting to dominate the conversation, now found himself on the defensive. His calculated attack had backfired and Barron was dismantling him piece by piece. But Turner wasn't ready to back down yet. He straightened his tie, forcing a smirk as he turned back to Barron. You know, Barron, he began, his voice laced with condescension. It's easy to stand up for your family when you've grown up in a golden tower. Out here in the real world, people like me have to ask the tough questions. That's what journalism is. A few scattered nods from his usual supporters in the crowd, but it wasn't enough. Something about this confrontation felt different. The usual rhythm of media takedowns wasn't working tonight. Turner's words sounded hollow, desperate even. And Barron knew it. He tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. You mean the real world? He asked, his voice calm yet cutting. The one where my mother is here supporting charities while you're trying to get a headline by humiliating her. Turner's smirk vanished. Barron stepped forward, his presence commanding without aggression. His voice didn't rise, but it commanded attention. You want to talk about the real world? Fine. He gestured to the audience. How many people here tonight came to hear about helping children, about education, about giving back? A few guests raised their hands. Others nodded in silent agreement. Even those who didn't necessarily support the Trumps knew why they had come. It wasn't for politics, it was for the cause. Barron turned back to Turner, his expression unwavering. And how many people here came to listen to you make this about yourself? A ripple of laughter coursed through the crowd. The dynamic had flipped completely. Turner was no longer the one controlling the moment. He opened his mouth to respond, but Barron wasn't finished yet. No, really, Barron continued, his tone mockingly patient. Because as far as I can tell, the only person in this room who thought this was about politics was you. The applause started slowly, then built into a wave. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was approval. Turner's face turned a shade of red darker than his tie. He tried to speak, but the moment had already slipped through his fingers. His confidence, his arrogance, it was all gone. And then Barron delivered the final blow. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to be intimate yet piercing. Next time, he said smoothly, if you want to attack a Trump, maybe try picking on someone your own size. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Turner stiffened, his jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the microphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had played his game, and tonight he had lost. Barron turned back toward his mother, standing tall, composed. The youngest Trump had just made his mark, and the world had taken notice. Turner, still standing frozen, realized just how bad things had turned against him. His once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a stiff, forced expression, as if he were trying to hold onto his composure while the ground crumbled beneath him. Barron stood tall, shoulders squared, his gaze locked onto Turner like a predator watching wounded prey. The crowd knew it. Turner wasn't the hunter anymore, he was the hunted. Desperate to salvage what was left, Turner adjusted his tie and let out a weak chuckle. "So that's it then?" he asked, trying to sound amused, though his voice had lost its edge. "You're telling me I can't ask questions because it might upset your family?" Barron didn't even blink. His voice remained smooth, controlled. "You didn't ask a question," he said. "You made an accusation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Even those who weren't Trump supporters couldn't deny that Barron was right. Turner's jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward a few other journalists in the room, silently pleading for backup, but none of them spoke. They knew what had just happened. Turner had lost control of the room. Barron stepped forward again, not aggressive, just deliberate. His presence alone was enough to make Turner take a half step back. "You tried to frame my mother as a villain," Barron continued, "but you failed. Because the truth is, she's here helping, making a difference." He gestured toward the charity banners hanging behind the stage, displaying the faces of the children and families Melania's foundation had supported. "And what are you doing?" Barron tilted his head slightly, voice calm yet cutting. "What are you actually contributing tonight besides negativity?" Turner's face deepened to a darker shade of red. His confidence was gone, his body language betraying him. His shoulders tensed, his grip on the microphone tightened. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. "If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time." The room was still buzzing, whispers crackling like electricity through the air. Jack Turner, the once confident journalist, stood frozen. His face, which had moments ago been filled with smug arrogance, was now pale with realization. He had lost. And not just lost, he had been dismantled, piece by piece, in front of the very audience he had hoped to impress. Barron Trump remained where he stood, shoulders squared, his presence radiating an unshakable confidence. He had come to his mother's defense not with anger, not with insults, but with precision, with control. And now, the room belonged to him. Turner swallowed hard. His grip on the microphone tightened, knuckles turning white. He had spent years in the media, crafting narratives, tearing down figures who stood in the way of his agenda. He had been sure tonight would be another easy win. A moment of humiliation for Melania Trump, a viral clip to be shared across the internet. Instead, he was the one standing in the wreckage of his own making. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. That much was clear. Some of them were shaking their heads, others whispering in hushed tones. Even those who might have silently agreed with him weren't willing to defend what had just happened. He had played his hand, and he had played it badly. "I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly. Barron smirked. It wasn't cruel, nor was it taunting. It was the expression of someone who knew the game had been won. "Then maybe," he said, his voice steady, controlled, "you should try doing it better." The room erupted. This time, it wasn't just polite applause, it was thunderous. A standing ovation, waves of claps and cheers crashing through the ballroom. Even those who had come in skeptical of the Trumps couldn't deny what had just happened. Jack Turner had walked in expecting to dominate, to turn the night into a spectacle of his own making. Instead, he had become the spectacle. And Barron Trump, he had done what no one had expected. He had outmaneuvered an experienced journalist in front of an elite audience and, more importantly, in front of the cameras. From the side of the stage, Melania Trump, who had watched everything unfold in quiet composure, finally let a small smile cross her lips. She didn't need to say anything. Her son had already said everything that needed to be said. Turner realized there was no saving himself from this disaster. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his microphone and turned away. The walk of shame had begun. The cameras followed every step. Turner had walked into the grand ballroom expecting to break headlines. Instead, he had become one. And Barron Trump? He simply turned back toward his mother, standing tall, composed. Because tonight he wasn't just defending her, he was proving that the next generation of Trumps wasn't going anywhere. The silence that followed Turner's retreat was thick with finality. He was gone, but his defeat lingered in the air, undeniable and absolute. Barron let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. This wasn't how he had expected the night to unfold, but he hadn't hesitated when the moment came. He had spoken, he had stood his ground, and now, for the first time, the world saw him not as a boy in the background, but as a force of his own. Melania stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but one filled with unspoken pride. The ballroom, sensing the moment, rose to their feet once more. The standing ovation was deafening. This wasn't just applause for Melania. It wasn't just for Barron. It was for the shift. For years, people had underestimated him. They had seen him as just the youngest Trump, the quiet observer in the shadows of the White House. But after tonight, no one would ever make that mistake again. Yet even as Turner reached the exit, his mind spun furiously. His career, his reputation, it couldn't end like this. He needed something. Some last-ditch attempt to flip the narrative. He turned back. The crowd was still standing, still applauding Barron. Turner's jaw clenched. He lifted the microphone one last time. "Well," he said, forcing a smirk, though his voice had lost its edge. "If you can't handle a little pushback, maybe politics isn't for you." The words rang hollow. Desperate. The room fell into a heavy silence. The audience had already moved past Turner, and this feeble attempt at reclaiming the moment was like throwing a single match into a storm, hoping for a fire. Barron didn't even blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't a condescending smirk, nor was it mocking. It was the kind of smile that sent a message. That's all you've got. That's when Turner knew. It was over. He had thrown everything he had, and yet Barron was standing there. Untouched, composed, unshaken. And the applause that followed wasn't just for Barron anymore. It was for the fact that Jack Turner had just buried himself. A few murmurs started rippling through the audience. Someone chuckled. A wealthy donor near the front turned to his wife and whispered something that made her smile. Turner saw it. He saw all of it. And in that moment, he knew. He wasn't just walking away from this conversation. He was walking away a failure. His face tightened. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible over the noise, before finally turning around and disappearing through the exit. The cameras had captured everything. By the time Turner was gone, Barron turned back toward his mother. Melania looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with the grace and composure that had defined her for years, she reached out, gently straightening his suit jacket. A small gesture, one that spoke volumes. Barron smirked slightly, giving her a small nod before turning back to the room. The crowd, sensing the finality of the moment, rose once more. This time, the standing ovation wasn't just for what had happened. It was for what it meant. There are moments in life that don't just define who you are, they change how the world sees you. That night, under the dazzling lights of the grand ballroom, Barron Trump was no longer just a boy standing in his family's shadow. He stepped forward, faced the challenge, and proved that true strength doesn't come from shouting the loudest or tearing others down. It comes from integrity and composure. The moment he walked onto that stage wasn't just about defending his mother. It was a declaration: I will not allow anyone to disrespect what I hold dear. That is a lesson we can all take to heart. How many times in life have we seen someone being attacked, but unable to defend themselves? How many times have we wanted to stand up for something but held back, afraid of judgment, afraid of being criticized? Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is acting despite the fear. We don't have to shout to prove we're right. We only need to stand firm, refuse to be swayed by negativity, and let our actions speak louder than words. Jack Turner didn't lose because he wasn't skilled. He lost because he lacked integrity. He walked into that ballroom with one goal: to twist the narrative, to turn a charity event into a political attack, to make headlines at someone else's expense. But Barron didn't let that happen. He didn't attack Turner. He simply exposed the truth, and when truth shines, deception crumbles. Just like in life, if you stay true to your values, if you remain honest, no matter how many people try to distort reality, eventually their own lies will unravel. We live in a time when everyone has a voice. But what matters isn't how much we talk or how loudly we speak, it's whether we speak with purpose. Speak when it matters. Act when it's necessary. That is what Barron did, and that is what we should all learn. Ask yourself, if you were Barron Trump in that moment, what would you have done? Would you have remained silent to avoid conflict, or would you have stepped forward and said what needed to be said? Life isn't always fair. There will be days when you are misunderstood, doubted, and tested. But those are also the moments when you have the chance to show who you really are. Not everyone will stand on a stage in front of hundreds of people like Barron Trump. But every day we make small decisions. Will I let others define my worth? Or will I create it myself? Will I let things slide, or will I stand up for what's right? Life does not reward those who wait in silence. Life belongs to those who dare to rise, to act, and to stand firm in their truth. So the next time someone tries to tear you down, remember the moment Barron stood on that stage. And remember that you have the power to do the same.